Great. Thanks so much, Cheyenne. So let's get started. Welcome to our webinar. We're really glad to have you all with us here today. So again, my name is Kate Ellis, and I'm a Senior Associate at Forest Trend Supply Chain Initiative. I'm joined here today with my colleague Laura Weather, who's also a Senior Associate at the Supply Chain Initiative. We're also joined by Julie Nash, the Senior Program Director of Food and Forest at Ceres, as well as Debora Diaz, who's the Senior Manager of Environmental Sustainability at the Consumer Goods Forum. Can we go to the next slide, please? So here's all of our lovely speakers. So for our agenda today, we'll first be looking kind of at what supply chain is and an overview of our latest report series. We'll then also go into further detail on some of our key findings and potential implications for investors. We will also hear about the latest findings from Ceres Food Emissions 50 updated benchmark, what we can kind of look forward to in their report. And we'll also go through some high-level findings from the Consumer Goods Forum latest annual report as well. And at the end, we'll have a Q&A, so please remember to send any questions that you have in the chat box, and we'll be sure to get to those. So that's our agenda for today. Thank you again for joining us. So without further ado, I will start by taking us through what supply chain is. So Forest Trend Supply Chain was founded in 2014. Our dataset tracks corporate commitments to address deforestation from the production and sourcing of agricultural commodities across all levels of the supply chain. In addition to commitments, we also evaluate companies' sustainability policies and annual progress towards achieving their sustainability goals. And our work is really intended to support stakeholders' decision-making, whether that's governments, investors, or others, to drive greater corporate transparency and accountability in supply chains. So over the last 8 years, supply chain has gathered market intelligence on over 900 companies, and we publish a snapshot of this data that we collect on our free-to-use and publicly accessible website, supplychange.org. So now I'll take us through an overview of our latest report series. Supply Chain recently published a 2-part series exploring how companies have reduced commodity-driven deforestation in their supply chain since 2020. In our first report, we evaluated companies' commitments, and in the second, we assessed how companies are implementing their sustainability policies and how they've progressed over time. So these reports are part of our ongoing work with Ceres to identify global trends in company sustainability commitments and their implementation in forest risk supply chains over the next 5 years. And at its core, our work is really intended to help guide investor engagement with companies by providing a snapshot of their progress towards reducing deforestation. Next slide, please. So in this report series, we assessed 125 companies, which represent some of the most prominent retailers, manufacturers, or traders sourcing forest risk commodities from the tropics. So how do we select these companies? In our selection process, supply chains use several indicators to identify the most prominent companies with exposure to deforestation. So in addition to looking across supply chains, we looked at how their operations broke down geographically, the financing of these companies, as well as their sector classification. So for example, in analyzing sector exposure to deforestation, we prioritize companies operating under consumer discretionary or consumer staples. And within each sector, we also accounted for key industries, including beverages, apparel, among others. So as you can see here, the companies collectively accounted for over 4 trillion in global sales and made up approximately 60% of the holdings in consumer discretionary sector and 70% of the holdings in the consumer staples sector. So this was just really one way to help us identify companies with the greatest market share operating in these forest risk supply chains. So now moving on to how we evaluated these companies. Supply Chain evaluated companies based on their exposure to key forest risk commodities, including cattle, cocoa, palm, soy, and timber. We then looked at the commitments and policies that companies use in their operations and how they performed on these commitments over time. And to evaluate the companies, we also looked at publicly available data between 2019 and early 2021. This included corporate sustainability reports, investment briefs, industry assessments, and other resources. So I won't go into any further detail on our methodology here, but please note that you can find more information in our reports or online at supplychange.org. You go to the next slide, please. All right, so what is our report showing us in terms of corporate performance? As you can see here, the great news is that we found 90% of companies we evaluated had a commitment to address deforestation in at least one of the commodities in their supply chain. However, companies varied widely in their reported progress and implementation. So for example, we found that 40% of time-bound commitments had deadlines that have already passed. This may be attributed to many different things, from pandemic challenges, changes in management, or shifting sustainability priorities, just to name a few. But ultimately, it suggests that many companies are missing their time-bound deadlines and really appear to be figuring out how to effectively communicate their next steps. So since supply chain was founded, obviously the number of companies with commitments have grown significantly. The increase in commitments can be attributed to many different factors. For instance, when the New York Declaration on Forests was signed in 2014, many companies signed on to eliminate deforestation in their supply chains by 2020. And over time, this has really continued to represent a crucial year for the review and reflection of forest-related goals. But we've seen, as 2020 has come and gone, our reporting underlines that although most companies we evaluated have implemented commitments to reduce forest loss and are working to better understand their impacts at the source of production, they're really struggling to fully disclose how they're implementing their commitments and their progress over time in a full and comprehensive way. So above all, these findings also demonstrate that urgent action is needed to overcome persistent barriers in these making these commitments across forest risk supply chains. Next slide, please. So with that in mind, both companies and investors will have a pivotal role in the next 5 years to address commodity-driven deforestation. So companies' ability to provide investors with the latest data will be a critical component to accelerating action and effectively delivering on these commitments. So this report series, in addition to the work produced by our colleagues at Ceres and the Consumer Goods Forum, which we'll explore a little bit later in this webinar, will really all help provide investors with this actionable information to secure long-term investments, mitigate risks, as well as enhance sustainable practices in their corporate portfolios. So on that note, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Laura to provide more detailed findings from our report and key recommendations for investors regarding their corporate portfolios.
Okay, thank you for that, Kate. Good morning, everyone, or afternoon. So I'm Laura Weather. I am a senior associate at Forest Trend Supply Chain Initiative. And I'm gonna expand on what Kate just presented and go over some of the highlights from our recent report series, and just go into a little bit about what this tells us about the current state and emerging trends in this corporate action on deforestation and climate change space. So as Kate said, we found that around 90% of the 125 companies that we researched had commitments to reduce or eliminate deforestation in their commodity supply chains. And this is a jump from previous supply chain findings, but it probably reflects higher levels of engagement from these 125 companies in particular, which are large, have a lot of resources, have large public, are public facing, so it's probably reflects this rather than a major jump in engagement from companies more broadly. But regardless, as you can see from this chart, the commodity coverage of commitments has been fairly consistent with past supply chain findings. Generally, we've seen that higher proportions of companies make commitments for their palm oil and timber sourcing, and less for cattle, cocoa, and soy, irrespective of the respective deforestation footprints of these commodities. This general trend by commodity has been fairly similar for many other indicators as well, including monitoring, traceability, and progress reporting. And on that note, disclosure of commitment progress has also been fairly high overall. We found that over 3/4 of commitments had reported progress, but at the same time, almost 1/4 of companies had at least one commitment that was dormant. And dormant is a term that we at Supply Change coined several years ago to describe commitments that have never reported progress, either to the main target or to any of the interim milestones, even though the target date has passed, or if the commitment did not have a target date that it was announced more than 2 years ago. And this is an issue. Companies and investors should be concerned about dormant commitments because this may signal ineffective management of deforestation risk, which could jeopardize companies' long-term financial stability and investment returns. And progress disclosure and commitment dormancy followed a similar trend by commodity, demonstrating the disparate availability of resources for each commodity, like monitoring tools, certification standards, and reporting frameworks, which can influence companies' performance. For example, palm oil and timber have longer histories of public awareness and advocacy on deforestation, and greater availability of resources like certification standards, which can help companies make and deliver on commitments. So the final findings I'll go over are from some of our newest metrics. Supply Chain recently expanded its metrics on climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, and we are now tracking corporate targets to reduce emissions and annual emissions disclosure data. So as a quick recap for those who need it, the GHG protocol classifies companies' direct emissions as Scope 1, indirect emissions from purchased energy use are Scope 2, and then all other indirect emissions are Scope 3, and this includes emissions embedded in the supply chains of purchased goods and services. So almost 3/4 of companies had a time-bound target to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and but only about 1/3 of targets did not, but about 1/3 of targets did not include Scope 3 emissions, and annual disclosure of emissions followed a similar pattern, with around 2/3 of companies disclosing emissions from Scopes 1 and 2, and only half disclosing emissions in Scope 3. And Scope 3 emissions comprise as much as 90% of consumer goods companies' total carbon footprints. So these are critically important emissions for companies to be aware of and to work to reduce. And this non-disclosure and lack of targets means that a sizable number of companies are neglecting a major source of emissions, which exposes them to reputational and other financial risks from climate change inaction. So just to briefly sum up the key takeaways from our latest research and report, though these prominent companies are generally active in making commitments and reporting progress, there are gaps, especially for commodities like cattle that have fewer available resources to support companies' efforts, and investing in developing and expanding the resources could be a valuable way for investors to help companies pinpoint common weak areas and determine where and what kinds of support can be leveraged to help companies make and deliver on commitments. So on that note, I will turn things over to Julie Nash from Ceres, who will speak more to the role that investors have in driving action on deforestation.
Thank you, Laura. If you move to the next slide. So my name is Dr. Julie Nash. I am the Senior Program Director of Food and Forests at Ceres. And for those of you who have not heard about Ceres, Ceres is a nonprofit organization working with the most influential capital markets to be able to solve the greatest sustainability challenges. Specifically, our work focuses in on investors, so powerful networks of investors and global collaborations with investor groups. We drive action, and it really inspire market-based solutions through the economy to be able to build a just and sustainable future. Our 4 areas that we focus in on, of course, is deforestation. It's where we first started out, and we've been working in this space for about 10 years. We also do a lot of work, which I'll talk about in this presentation, on greenhouse gas and agriculture and within supply chains. We work on natural climate solutions, and we're recently doing a lot more when it comes to biodiversity. If you can move to the next slide. So I'll talk specifically about one of our campaigns, Food Emissions 50, and you can certainly see more about this initiative on our website at Ceres, but it was an initiative that launched in July of 2021, not very long ago, actually, and it focused in on the 50 largest emitting food companies within North America. The goal is to be able to have them improve their disclosures of greenhouse gas emissions, including their scope 3 emissions from land use change, set science-based targets, and develop and disclose comprehensive transition plans. You can certainly read more about that at the Ceres website. But I'd like to focus in on the linkage between the two. If you'll go to the next slide, don't worry, I will not read off every name that is on this page. What I just wanted to be able to do is be able to talk about the alignment and the breadth of companies that we're working with. So it's both consumer discretionary and consumer staples that are included. So everything from food traders all the way to retailers. If you'll go to the next slide, I'll focus a little bit closer in on our theory of change. So what we really do is work with large and small institutional investors to be able to mobilize them, to be able to make them aware, to be able to build the business case for engaging on deforestation and agricultural climate risks within their portfolio. Based on that knowledge that they've gained through us and other groups, they engage specifically with companies that are within their portfolio. And they ask these companies to improve their disclosures, their targets, and their climate transition plans. As a result, we look to be able to see and hope that companies improve their disclosure, commit to science-based targets, and implement credible transition plans. What I wanted to be able to highlight is the role of some of supply chain findings and how that helps us. So this material not only helps in terms of building the business case for investors to be able to act, but they also help in terms of investors when they actually engage with the companies that are within their portfolio. So for instance, supply chain key finding 6, nearly 1/4 of companies have at least one commitment to which they have never reported progress. Actually, I think it was about 4 years ago when we started to hear first about these dormant commitments in kind of the race to 2020. And I can clearly remember when supply chain talked about this work. And it basically kickstarted us to be able to have an entire focus in on this idea of disclosure of progress, annual quantitative disclosure of progress, which has been a strong part of the investor ask strategy for a number of years. I also wanted to highlight another one of supply chain's key findings from their report, the fact that disclosures on greenhouse gas emissions are on the rise, but in many instances, disclosures from deforestation emissions are really lagging. And so that's one of the things that has been built into Food Emissions 50, that we're looking not only for generic scope 3, we're looking for purchased goods and services, we're looking from agricultural emissions, and specifically for land use change. So it kind of shows you how these two areas are brought together, and how reports like supply chain can really help investors as they engage with companies. I'll turn it to the last slide now to quickly finalize it, if the slide is able to actually move. Thank you. So on the final slide, I just wanted to be able to give a sneak peek on some of the results that I've had so far. So, and again, we can't take credit for all of these changes, though there's a large ecosystem of actors who are currently working on this. But I did want to be able to highlight, out of the 50 companies that we have been tracking since July 2021, 25 of them, so half of them, have taken 44 actions to be able to improve their disclosures and targets. So 10 of those 25 companies really improved their emissions disclosure. So there were many companies who have not, might have even been talking about setting up targets, but hadn't been forthcoming in terms of what their actual emissions footprint was. And we see that as an essential starting block. And then there were 15 companies who actually set new science-based targets, including scope 3, since the initiative launched. So I hope this gave you a flavor of how we work with supply chains, and how some of the work really is changing the market. And I'll pass it back to supply chain.
Thanks, Julie. I think now we're going to go and hear from Debora Diaz from the Consumer Goods Forum.
Thanks, Kate. If we could go to the next slide, please. So I'm Debora Diaz, Senior Manager at the Consumer Goods Forum, managing the Forest Positive Coalition. Just a brief overview of what the Consumer Goods Forum is. We're a membership organization that's CEO-led, bringing together retailers and manufacturers of the consumer goods industry. And under the umbrella of the Consumer Goods Forum, we have a number of coalitions, many of them focused on sustainability. And one of those coalitions, which we like to call coalitions of action, is the Forest Positive Coalition. So the Forest Positive Coalition is led by 22 companies, most of them retailers and manufacturers. You can see them on the map there. We do have a couple of food service companies and one manufacturer. And our mission is to leverage collective action and systemic efforts to remove deforestation, forest degradation, and conversion from key commodity supply chains. We work with a couple of strategic partners, namely the Tropical Forest Alliance, TFA, which many of you probably know, and also ProForest, who are our technical partner. If we can go to the next slide, please. So the work of the Forest Positive Coalition was actually, we can say, born in about 2010, where the board of the Consumer Goods Forum pledged to help achieve zero net deforestation by 2020. And as we were getting closer to that date, we realized that we weren't where we wanted to be. And the goal itself wasn't very clear and well thought out. So we took a step back and tried to think through what is our theory of change, and essentially what needs to happen at a systemic level to help achieve deforestation at a global scale for the commodities that we were working on. So we are working on palm oil, soy, paper, pulp and packaging, and beef. And what you see here is the theory of change under that sort of systemic approach that the Forest Positive Coalition is aiming to achieve. So the first pillar of our theory of change is on accelerating efforts to remove deforestation from commodity supply chains. In the previous model, we were working with companies to help them become their own supply chains become deforestation or conversion free. So often this was very focused on certification. So companies would look at their individual supply chains and buy certified commodities to try and ensure those commodities were deforestation or conversion free. I just saw something on chat. What's new with the approach is that now we're looking at the businesses, the suppliers and traders, and working with our suppliers and traders so that they themselves become deforestation and conversion free, meaning that companies in the forest positive coalitions have pledged to purchase from forest positive traders and suppliers. It doesn't mean that the companies in the forest positive coalition are only looking to that. They're also making sure that their own supply chains are deforestation and conversion free, but are now also bringing their suppliers and traders along. The second pillar of our work is to encourage more transformational change in key commodity landscapes. So we're looking at existing landscape initiatives that are currently quite siloed and uncoordinated, bringing companies closer to what's happening in the ground and moving towards a more integrated multi-stakeholder land use. And especially here, looking at it from a climate, nature, people lens, it's important for us to underline that when we talk about forest positive, we're not only talking about deforestation and conversion, but we're also encompasses in that is human rights and also climate, and especially around landscape engagement is an area where the human rights and climate and forests are very much intertwined. If we can go to the next slide, I'll just speak very quickly to transparency. So our transparency approach, right now, we have companies that are reporting on the KPIs that we have come up with in the roadmaps, which I'll show on the next slide very briefly. They are reporting in using different methodologies, but reporting on the same KPIs. We want to move companies to align their reporting, so using similar methodologies, the same methodologies. And ultimately, we want to extend this approach beyond the coalition and working with existing platforms such as CDP, BFI, and so on, so that other companies are reporting on the KPIs that the coalition is itself reporting on. We can go to the next slide. I won't talk to this in detail. I mentioned roadmaps. These are documents where we outline the commitments, actions, and KPIs for each of the commodities we work on. And I've outlined them here. I won't talk to them in detail, but we have published for each of the commodities that we worked on. And on the next slide. And we just published our KPI report, driving transformational change throughout the value chain. So in 2021, for the first time, companies published the KPIs through our report. And this year, we're able to publish progress. The progress has been on transparency itself. So more companies are reporting on more KPIs, and we've been able to see progress through there. As we go forward, we go to the next slide. We want to increase alignment of reporting methodologies and quality of reporting so that we're able to show actual concrete impact and progress through our KPIs, encourage wider uptake, and especially important for us is alignment on supplier and trader assessment methodologies. It's been a challenge for us, and we're working with a number of organizations to move forward on that. But also to update our roadmaps and KPIs to reflect the evolving landscape, including human rights related KPIs, and integrate emissions disclosure in forest positive transparency reporting to help external stakeholders as well as investors to be able to assess how the companies in the forest positive coalition are doing over time. And I think I've run out of time. Back to you, Kate.
Thanks so much, Debora. It's great to hear about what you guys are working on with the forest position. I think this data, these reports that we're talking about really give us a lot of valuable information to think about, especially as we come off the back of Climate Week and look forward to COP27 next month, and just kind of understand how companies are performing and kind of the progress areas still needed as we look to the future. But I think on that note, we're going to transition now into the Q&A. And I think I've seen a few things come into the chat. I think the first question would be, how can investors leverage information in the latest supply chain reports to engage with companies? So Laura, it would be great to hear a little bit from you, and Julie and Debora, I'm not sure if maybe you could speak to that in the context of the Food Emissions 50 and the latest CGF report as well. I think that could apply to all of the reports we're speaking to today.
Yeah,
so
sure.
again,
I can go into it just a little bit. I think I'll kick it to Julie in after a few minutes, just because I think she knows so much more about the investor side of it. But just to speak quickly on it, I think there's a lot of information here that kind of shows where companies are really making strides and where they're kind of struggling to really implement, to quantify their progress, to disclose all this information. And I think in looking at what the findings are, I think investors could maybe pinpoint where these common weak areas are and where companies might need the more support, where they could really leverage their influence and their position and their resources to kind of invest in the types of things like reporting frameworks or monitoring tools or risk tools or things like that that would really help companies figure out what to do and what to report, and especially for these commodities that are a little bit more overlooked, like cattle and soy, that haven't really historically gotten the same attention or resources as palm and timber, for example. So that's what I've got to say. I'll kick it to Julie.
So I would say that there are two different ways that the materials can be used. So one, I think I was talking about this, and I think it was Stephen Donofrio. He was giving a presentation to a small group of investors as we were kicking off our deforestation work and our partnership with PRI on deforestation. And Forest Trends brought forward this idea of dormant commitments. And so it was something that resonated with the investors within our community, and they wanted to be able to know more and wanted to be able to see that information on a company by company basis. So that was one of the areas where the work by Forest Trends, and it was a report, really helped inform the actual strategy that we were developing with the investors at that time. So that's one way. Another way I would say, and again, this is something we partnered with in the past, is we realized early on that traceability was going to be a key element in terms of any kind of strong implementation. Again, this was a number of years ago. So Ceres partnered with Forest Trends to be able to develop a whole range of materials, and a very large webinar, I remember at the time, in terms of traceability and transparency. That has been a core part of the investor ask strategy. What isn't as visible is kind of the third way. So I guess there are three ways, not two ways. But I guess the third thing that's probably not as visible is that at this point, for instance, the Food Emissions 50, we are engaging with each of these 50 companies, whether it's Ceres or through investors or through large investor coalitions. It does vary. And information such as what Forest Trends puts out, I say this incorrectly, but it's the large N. So when a company is trying to be able to figure out where they sit within their competitive set, you might be able to tell a McDonald's how it is that Burger King, I'm making something up, but how Burger King stands, you know, they face off. But I do think that that being able to understand how many different companies in general are how they aren't an issue is helpful in terms of those individual engagements. So I hope that answered the question.
That's great. And Debora, I'm not sure if you have anything to add in the context of CGF and what that looks like for your latest report.
I can't speak for investors. We have had meetings with investor representatives, and for them the information is useful to have on hand because it outlines in detail what companies are doing. At the moment, it is limited by the fact that there are different methodologies, so you can't really compare like for like. And some of the information is still quite qualitative. So, which is not just the case for Forest Positive Coalition. This is the case. This is the norm for the moment, which is why one of our ambitions is to bring that reporting beyond the coalition and try to put everybody on the same sort of level playing field when it comes to reporting, and therefore make it the job easier for external stakeholders and investors to be able to evaluate company performance and the impact that they're making as well.
Thanks, Debora. Okay, I'm trying to look in the chat box and see if there are any other great questions coming through. I see one from Dean Current. His question is, we work with large community managed forest areas that are producing and marketing timber and non-timber forest products under certified sustainable management plans. My question is if those communities are able to measure and report social and environmental impacts of their forest level and processing operations under acceptable standards, might that make their products more attractive to companies that purchase those products so that companies can meet their commitments? So again, if those communities are able to measure and report social and environmental impacts, does that make the products more attractive to companies so that they can meet their commitments? And I think his follow-up question was, are there currently accepted reporting standards for measuring the impacts of their supply chains? So kind of a two-part question.
Yeah, maybe I can respond to this one. I can't speak for individual companies, whether they're in the Forest Positive Coalition or not. But it does help. One of the aspects that we're looking at when it comes to landscape engagement is precisely how do we measure progress and impact, and especially how we measure that from not just the environmental angle but also the people angle and the climate angle. So absolutely, I think it's helpful and important for concessions to be measuring this and being transparent about it. In terms of accepted reporting standards, and also this is a challenge that we face, there are a number of reporting standards and scorecards and existing platforms, which is why it's important for us, not just for the Forest Positive Coalition, to uniformize what we're doing, but also to be able to look to one set or a smaller set of information to be able to make decisions on actions they take as companies individually and collectively.
I can add one thing on. I think that we've actually just seen the greenhouse gas protocol and Science-Based Targets Initiative be able to update their guidance when it comes to land use change. I'm not saying that it's fully complete yet. I know that there are still things that are in pilot testing, but I think that from a greenhouse gas standpoint, there's definitely a push to be able to have one kind of science-based way of being able to affirm targets that'll actually reduce emissions over time. So I would encourage the group to be able to look to that guidance to be able to understand how the work that they're doing is actually looking to be able to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
Thanks, Julie. I see another question too popping up in the chat. So what else can be done beyond the European Union timber regulation? As one of my clients in Europe asks, the EU TR is not sufficing the purpose. Any solutions in case there are different views?
I could potentially talk about the SEC work that's currently underway, if that is of interest. So one of the things that Ceres has been working on, and I will admit that it's not my team within Ceres that's been doing this. We have a large team that's looking at how to be able to have mandatory climate risk and climate impact disclosures. And through the Securities Exchange Commission in the United States. So we look at that as another potential way to be able to including scope 3 emissions, where those scope 3 emissions have a very large impact. So companies are required to be able to disclose what their scope 3 emissions are on a year-over-year basis. And if they have put together and made commitments to reduce those, to be able to show the plans that they have to be able to reduce those emissions. So that's one of the many things that is happening that brings some of this work into mandatory rather than voluntary disclosure.
Laura, Deborah, I'm not sure if you have anything to add to that question.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything to add on that.
I assume that this is for producer companies. We have a number of guidance documents that we put out for companies, not just consumer goods companies, but also guidance for producers. In case of paper, pulp, and packaging, we are working on guidance for producers, and we'll be publishing fairly soon guidelines for implementation of our roadmaps. All of this information is or will be open source, so anyone can look through those and look at some of the recommendations that are made for not just for consumer goods companies, but companies in general, and also producers.
Great. Thanks, Deborah. I think another question that we have coming through is, what are some of the corporate trends that you're seeing in these reports that you would like to explore in future reporting? So if there's any key material that has come out in these reports, like what would we want to continue to explore? What do we think is most valuable?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess I'll start with that one. I mean, going forward, we're actually just getting started to do our 2022 round of company research. So I'm pretty excited that we'll be able to compare the results to what we have in 2021 and do a little bit more like temporal overtime analysis, both this year and in the coming years. But then also this whole panel has actually been really great. I've been jotting down notes of things that we should remember to include to look for in our future research. I think, for example, some of the more detailed information on these emissions and the targets and disclosure about agricultural emissions and land use change specifically. I think we could go into a little bit more detail on that, which I think would be really cool. And then, yeah, so that kind of stuff, maybe look a little bit, check with the Forest Positive Coalition, their KPIs to make sure we're well aligned and we've got good coverage there as well. We're always looking to expand and make sure we're collecting the very best metrics and information. So yeah, so that's what I've got.
I can add. Oh, sorry, Deborah.
Just very quickly, I mean, I mentioned it earlier, for us, one of the challenges, but also one of the exciting areas for us is to be able to evaluate suppliers and traders. Although our reporting is more around being transparent, when it comes to progress, that's one of the areas that we think will be quite key for us, is to be able to evaluate suppliers and traders at a collective level, and then take action and using the available information that we can to do that. All right, go ahead, Julie.
Mine was going off in a different angle. One of the things that we hear and have been talking a lot to investors about is biodiversity. So if I really do feel that the overall investment and finance market is deeply understanding of what climate and climate change risk it can do to their portfolio. So there's a pretty broad base of understanding of that risk narrative. What is less so is the impacts and dependencies on nature and how that will affect their portfolio going into the future. Because you're not able to solve the climate crisis unless you are able to address nature loss, because they do go hand in hand. You can't solve one without the other. So I think that as I look into the future, next, few years, I think that looking at nature action and biodiversity and deforestation are so clearly linked in a lot of ways. But then also, as you look at natural climate solutions, not all natural climate solutions have the same type of biodiversity benefits. So I think that there will be more and more investors who are looking at this area and are looking for fundamental research to be able to understand what are the different ways to be able to start looking with the companies that they engage with on biodiversity.
Great. And I see another question, I think from Shiv, coming through the chat. The question is, these closures are a bit difficult in reporting, but is there anything readily available for marginal small-scale industries, as well as traders / commission agents?
I might be able to take a little stab. I don't think that this really addresses the question fully, but I do think that there's a clear recognition that as larger companies put together climate transition plans, there are impacts to those within the value chain, and that a lot of those impacts can be disproportionate, either from the physical risks or the transition risks from climate. So that is one area that Ceres is doing more work on, is to be able to help investors be able to ask the right questions of companies, because we see this as a potential real reputation risk for the larger companies that have brand exposure. So I think that we're not quite there yet. A lot of institutions aren't, but I think that you're asking a great question that is probably going to be forefront in people's minds in just a few years.
But for consumer goods companies, when it comes to transparency and reporting and measurement in general, it's always going to be a bit more challenging when it comes to smaller plantations and smallholders. That is one area that for us, the way we have decided to tackle it is through landscape engagement, precisely, rather than sort of direct supply chain engagement. Although part of that will be also having to engage the larger suppliers and traders in that process as well.
Thanks, Deborah. And I think probably one of our last questions that I'm seeing in the question and answer box from a little earlier on is, where is the funding from this work coming from? So it seems like that's a question for all of our panelists here today.
The funding for which work?
I think it just means generally, like, from the different reports being talked about, like, where does this funding stem from that allows us to be able to, whether it's the supply chain report or food emissions 50, where does that funding kind of stem from?
I mean, for the Forest Positive Coalition, it comes fully from our members. Of course, when it comes to working in landscapes and throughout our work, we're always looking to partner with other organizations where it makes sense. But for the work of the Forest Positive Coalition, it's fully funded by the Forest Positive Coalition members.
And for Ceres, we have a number of different ways that Ceres is funded, through individual giving, through membership dues from our investors and our companies. But most of the food and forest work is supported by grants from the Moore Foundation and from the Norwegian government. I was about to use the acronym, but Norwegian government is probably a better way to say it. And those two groups have been instrumental in terms of funding the work of investors moving companies on deforestation.
And just to add to that, I think this particular company research and report was from Norwegian government funding, funded that, but we also use a number of other, we've had in the past historically a lot of various different grants to help fund the company research. Sometimes on an ongoing basis, or kind of on a case-by-case basis, if an organization wants us to do a deep dive in a particular group of companies or a particular topic area, commodity or geographic focus or anything like that.
And if you want more details, we have an annual report. We're very transparent about our funding, and I would bet that Forest Trends annual report, which is always so fantastic, would probably have the transparent reporting of all of the different sources of funding that you have.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, everybody. I think before to close things out, I know we're starting to reach the end of our time together, but I just wanted to open it up to our panelists in the case that there's any last comments or things that we want to say before we start to close things out. So I just want to open it up to you guys, Laura, Julie, and Deborah.
Just thank you for inviting me and allowing me to participate in the webinar.
Likewise, thank you for inviting me. It's been great to be able to speak to you today.
Yeah, thanks everyone for coming. Thanks Julie and Deborah for participating. Thanks Kate for stepping into the moderator position at the last minute. Yeah, this has been great. I don't know how anything else I have to add, but and thank you to Cheyenne and Verena for all their help on the comms side as well. But yeah, this has been great.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, and thank you to everybody in the chat box sending us great questions. That's been wonderful. And of course, thank you to our wonderful speakers. It's been a really great discussion today. And we will be sure after we close this out to follow up with a recording and have that posted to our website. And of course, for anyone interested in more information, I encourage you all to check out Supply Chain's website, Ceres, CGF. There's so much great information there too for people to explore and learn more about the latest reports and findings for all these different groups. So thank you again so much to everybody. And I think on that note, we'll close this thing out. So thank you all.